Hello, and thank you for coming to this this evening at the glamorous Prospect headquarters, and welcome to those of you who are joining online. There have been a couple of changes to the personnel here this evening. If you were expecting to come along and congratulate Sir William Lewis on his knighthood, I think he found it all a bit overwhelming, and he has sent plain Mr. Kamal Ahmed here. And if you were expecting Charlotte Ivers, I'm afraid she got a better offer tonight. She was she was asked to do question time, and I mean I can't think of anything better than being here tonight. But her editor apparently thought it would be better for the Sunday Times brand if she went on in front of an audience of millions. But we do have Laura Hackett from the Sunday Times, which is great because Laura Hackett is a true Gen Zer. We've got two Gen Xers here, and I'm a baby boomer, so we've got quite a lot of variety on the panel. Just to more formally introduce Kamal. Kamal, you work for the, you founded and you're editor-in-chief of the News Movement. Just tell us in 2 sentences what the News Movement is.
So thanks, Alan. We're not a stir yet. We're a new media organization driven by young journalists. Average age of our newsrooms in New York and London is 25, and we're about thinking about how we can bring trusted, engaging, fact-based news and useful information to the next generation of consumers.
That was very pizzly put. Then we have Suzanne Heywood, ex-Treasury, ex-McKinsey, and the author of a book. Do you want to just hold up your book? Because I know you've been...
It's an author moment.
And by the time you finish this evening, I know you want to buy her book, and you got some that you'll sign upstairs at the end.
We do indeed. We've got some upstairs. We've seen whether or not people want to buy them by the end of the speech.
I'm sure
they might kind of run away screaming.
And you're CEO of EXOR. Tell us about EXOR.
Yeah, so EXOR, it's interesting. Most people have never heard of EXOR. And by the way, it's not Exxon. Several people asked me that when I first, not Exxon. So EXOR is like a holding company. We're a listed entity, listed in the Netherlands, half owned by the Agnelli family of Italy. And then we own about 14 other companies. And when I say own, I mean we're the largest shareholder of, and you've probably heard of quite a few of these. So we're the largest shareholder of Ferrari, Louboutin shoes, the ones with the red soles, the Economist newspaper, Case New Holland makes big agricultural equipment, Iveco trucks, Juventus football club, and so on and so on. So we own lots of companies that people do know, and people don't really know us as a holding entity. And at holding entity, we're very small. There's only 25 people. So we're a bit like Berkshire Hathaway. So I'm COO there, and I work with a number of the companies when I'm not writing books.
You're not writing books. And Laura, I heard Suzanne asking what your job entailed as deputy literary editor, and Kamal jumped in and said you destroyed people's lives. But can you put it more succinctly?
Well, some of it is that, but it's we're sort of putting the book pages together every year. We have the Sunday Times bestsellers list, which we control. We run the Sunday Times Young Writer Award every year, and I do a bit of writing myself throughout the paper, just if I wasn't busy enough with other things.
And you gave Suzanne's book a really nice.
We give it a really nice review. So
And
definitely
it
buy
was
a
in the
copy.
bestseller list last week.
Otherwise-
I'm feeling very warm.
Otherwise, it could have been a bit. It could have been a bit awkward this evening. We should have checked that out, but we didn't. So Mr. Ahmed.
Sir William Lewis is my co-founder in the business, which is why I'm here.
Hence these jives, yes. But we're talking about the future of communication in a multi-generational workforce. I guess workforces have always been multi-generational, but there's a particular reason, I think, for discussing this now. How do you think it's changed?
So before Will and I started this new business, and it's been 2 years now in existence, I worked at the BBC News. I was editor or director. That's an organization of over 8,000 people. And if we think back to when I started in my career in the media 30 years ago, the environment was you were just quite glad to have a job, and it was kind of yes sir to whoever happened to be your boss at the time. And for some time in my career, Alan was my boss, and it was very much yes Mr. Rusbridger, I will do as hard as whatever you've asked me, as hard as I can, as quickly as I can, at all times. As you know, Alan, a very obedient young journalist at the Guardian. But there have certainly been a lot of changes in terms of how we need to consider that next generation of consumers and Generation Z. And if I think now about the teams that I'm very fortunate to run, as I say, in New York and London, but also my own children, my daughter's 23 and my son is 19, they have grown up in a world where their expectations are very different, and they are the first socially native generation. And that means that how you manage talent now has changed enormously. And the key thing for me is you have to listen first and then move, rather than tell and order. And I think that is a significant change for many of us in leadership positions, which has meant that we've had to learn new ways of managing talent. And the main reason for that is because optionality for this generation, the side hustle, the other ways I can make money, my access to job satisfaction is much more evolved and much more abundant than when I was in the media sector. In the media sector, the gatekeepers to work in the media sectors were the newspaper editors, the channel controllers, the radio controllers. It was a very limited environment that meant I had to work for traditional organizations. But for my children and the next generation of talent in journalism, which is where I work, they can be creators with their own YouTube channel. If they get it right, they can make a huge amount of money with their own thing. And that has meant that we have to rethink how we engage and infuse young people to work with us in a way that we didn't have to think about 20 or 30 years ago.
Some people listening to that would say that's a bit woke, and that in the end, somebody has to tell somebody what to do, and all this listening stuff is fine. But in the end, you're the editor-in-chief, you've got to give orders, and they've got to do it. How do you balance the listening bit and the actually just bloody do it bit?
Well, you hope you don't have to get to the just bloody do it bit. I think that it's interesting that you think some people would respond like that, because I think if you do operate in that way, I think you will lose the room pretty quickly. So it is listen and then act. It's not listen and just keep on listening. As I say, to the teams, it's not an endless conversation, but it is a respectful one. And actually what you get, I find working with young people is that they are actually very respectful of the process, as long as they feel that they've had an input that has been listened to respectfully and thought about. And I know that many of the decisions we take are far better decisions because we listen first than they would have been if I had simply been deciding in that slightly army general way that, Alan, frankly, you and I grew up with in the media, which was the editor-in-chief did decide and drove in a certain way. Now, that led, of course, to brilliant journalism, and this is not replacement, but it is additional ways of thinking about working. So I was speaking to one of our young creators today. We're going to a conference in Dublin on Monday, and we were talking about how we cover drugs as the news movement. And the tone of much of the coverage around drugs for traditional media is parents telling pupils this stuff is dangerous. Well, hey, the pupils know that, and they're already involved in this area. So actually a much more useful debate for young people is around harm reduction and around learning safely about what this environment you're in is all about, and then telling that story in a completely different way. I would never have got there, frankly, Alan, on my own. I came to it with a much more just say no type of approach, which is much more in the traditional medias, is much more common in traditional media. Very different from the harm reduction conversation, friends finding out together, helping each other, onward journeys to think about how you can keep yourself safe in all sorts of different environments. And it's just a very interesting and different way of working. I quite object to this notion of that's quite woke. I don't really understand what that particularly means. Being awake to things is useful. listening is useful. And I think we have to change the way we consider this generation of talent, because they are actually enthusiasts, they are optimistic, they want to learn as well as be listened to. And I think that's a great positive environment to live in.
I never know what work means either, but I'm sure some people would say it. Somebody always does say it. How does what Kamal has been saying strike your ears, Suzanne?
Well, I guess I work in very different industries. So if I kind of categorize the companies that we have quite a lot of industrial companies that build things, often kind of big iron things like kind of tractors or combine harvesters or trucks or kind of cars. We've got luxury goods companies, and we've got sports and media companies. So the Economist and Juventus Football Club. By and large, I don't think kind of leadership has shifted quite as much. I mean, if you're running a tractor company, you do need somebody who's in charge. You know, you can't have everybody standing around discussing how to build the truck. I mean, there is a way to build the truck, and unfortunately, that is the way. And you've got, you know, you do want people to come forward with ideas, but not quite in the same sort of way. What I do, where I do agree though, is first of all, people do expect more conversation, and it's much more important in these organizations to be open to conversations and to kind of lead having had discussions, even though somebody isn't going to go off and set up their own YouTube travel channel making a truck, they still expect to be much more engaged than perhaps kind of other generations. And then the other kind of conversation which was the reason why I thought the book was quite kind of relevant, was this conversation about resilience, because I am seeing a difference. We were talking about it a little bit before, generation to generation, in the amount of resilience we're seeing in the workforce, and that is changing the conversation. So I think in our generation, we were quite resilient. And this is partly back to the kind of general, we were used to being kind of told what to do, and you got your head down and you did it. And sometimes that meant working quite long hours. I spent several years at McKinsey, and you end up working extremely long hours, and there's stuff to get done. There's then been a generation, which I've seen in these various different companies, which have been much more concerned about kind of purpose, much more concerned about work-life balance, much more concerned about kind of working hours. And by the way, these are all kind of good things, and they're kind of good conversations, but it has also felt like a kind of generation that's not very resilient. You know, things start, if something goes wrong, they're often much more impacted by that. And then the new generation, which is kind of coming through now, I'm seeing them as much more resilient. We've got kind of new interns and new recruits coming into the office who are all about, I want to be in the office, I want to get things done, I want to meet people. And some of those conversations seem to have slightly gone away. It's very interesting because, of course, that generation is coming into a much tougher world where, you know, mortgages are expensive, cost of living is high, it's hard to get a job, and they want to kind of come to work. And so the attitude has changed. And that means, back to our kind of topic, the way in which you talk to that generation, the way in which they want to communicate has changed again. So there's a slight danger that as leaders, we've readapted for that middle generation, which wanted, and actually now this new generation wants something a little bit different as well.
And since you mentioned your book, just say what it is about your own childhood that touches on resilience.
Well, yeah, so I had a very kind of odd childhood in a way. So when I was 7 years old, my father decided to load my brother and me on a boat. He was 6, I was 7, and to set off around the world in the wake of Captain Cook. My maiden name was Cook, so there's a little bit of a kind of excuse to sail around the world after Captain Cook. It was fairly flimsy, I have to say. And this was supposed to be a 3-year voyage around the world. So I was promised, we set sail when I was 7. We were going to be back by the time I was 10. And it turned into a decade. And after about 4 years or so, I started demanding to come back, and we had a vote, and my father overruled us, and we just kept sailing. On and on. Along the way, by the way, all sorts of things happened. You know, we got shipwrecked in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I ended up having multiple head operations without anesthetic on an atoll. We met cannibals. We went to all sorts of different places. We sailed round and around the South Pacific for years on end. And in the end, relationships on the boat deteriorated. So it's, I can't imagine, it kind of all went downhill. Particularly, yeah, anyway. So, and then I started fighting to try and escape And I worked out the only way off this boat was to educate myself, which was not straightforward, because the only way to educate myself on the boat was to do so by correspondence, because obviously I'm sitting on a boat, we don't have internet, we don't have anything else. But the problem with correspondence is the one thing you need is an address. And obviously being on a boat, you don't really have an address. And also you need kind of space and time, neither of which I also had. So it was rather a struggle, to say the least. And eventually I did escape and get off the boat and come back. And that's kind of the story of the book. Actually, the last bit was the worst bit. My parents kind of dumped my brother and me in New Zealand and sailed off. I didn't come back for some time. Anyway, and I've been kind of reflecting on some of the consequences of that. And there's all sorts of negative consequences of it. But really one positive consequence of it is I'm very resilient. And I am kind of conscious that in my generation, unfortunately, there's still not very many senior women. And one of the things that I think is quite kind of interesting is why that is, and why I have been able to kind of keep going. And part of that is resilience. I don't think it's that kind of things have been straightforward. All sorts of kind of bad things have happened along the way, including kind of sadly losing my husband 4 years ago. But I think there is a kind of resilience from a difficult childhood that you get. And so I've been trying to think about, how can you get that resilience without being locked on a boat for a decade and being shipwrecked, which is clearly not an ideal childhood. But there is something about hitting difficult times and finding a way through them. Hence this generational thing, which I am observing, which is it is very tough. And I've got similar age kids to you. I've got two 19-year-olds and a 21-year-old, and they're emerging into a much, much more difficult world than the generation above them. But I do see them being much more resilient. I mean, they're busy applying for endless jobs and kind of doing interviews, and I don't hear them kind of talking about, oh, I need a kind of nice work-life balance. It's kind of, can I get a job interview? And if I get a job interview, that's great. So I think resilience is, it's kind of hard one, but not necessarily a bad thing in moderation.
Laura, I'd love to know what that word how that word plays on your years, because I know I ran an Oxford College for 6 years, and resilience was used quite a lot by people who also used the word snowflacks. So
I did not use the word.
You didn't know, you
no,
didn't, but in Oxford there were people who used the word snowflakes, and the students didn't like the word resilience, but we were talking earlier. I mean, you just avoided COVID with your undergraduate degree, but you did have to with your master's degree. And how does resilience strike you as a word that is useful in this context?
To me, I don't at all. I wouldn't react at all negatively to that word. I think resilience is absolutely crucial. No matter really what career you're going into. And actually, I really agree with Suzanne when you say about the new generation sort of being different in that I read a lot of pieces about quiet quitting and Gen Z being very strict about work-life balance, and they want to start at 9 and finish at 5 and no one call them afterwards. That's really not something that I've experienced or seen in my peers. I think there's really a sense, I live with two friends who also work in the media. There's very much a sense that work is the sort of central driving force in our lives right now. And we're very happy to work long hours and go the extra mile. I think in return for that commitment and that resilience, I agree with Kamal that there is a sense that of wanting your voice to be heard. And sometimes that can cause slight friction in the newsroom, because lots of people who've been there for 20 or even 30 years, they grew up in an environment where you had to do your time and you had to be there for years and you had to slog away at maybe the less rewarding tasks before you earned the right to have your voice heard. And I think that's maybe a slight generational friction. I don't think that necessarily speaks to a lack of resilience, but I think it speaks to a feeling that if you're going to be committed and you're going to be resilient and put in the work, that you do want to be listened to. And I think actually at the Sunday Times, there is a culture of feeling that We want to have younger readers. We specifically want to target younger readers because if you want a publication to last indefinitely, you need to not have all your readers be over 65. And I think in response to that, they're very keen to listen to younger voices and to say, okay, well, you are in that age bracket. What do your peers want to read about? And do you want to write about it for them? So yeah. I think that's how it works.
While we were sitting upstairs waiting to come on, you had to suffer in silence while we talked about the birth of email and age of fax, all this kind of stuff. Give us so you're here as an anthropological example. Yeah. A young person, we're fascinated by you. How do you what's your communication day like? Are you on WhatsApp and Slack and all this stuff all day long and ignore your emails? Like, I mean,
you need a pipe, Alan, as well to do.
What's your day like?
I wouldn't dare ignore my emails. I think actually there is a real divide within the office of how people communicate, which means that I actually end up communicating on virtually every possible platform at the same time. I think there's a sense among both younger people in the office and I would say people who work more on the production side or sub-editor side of using channels like Slack, which is an instant messaging platform, whereas perhaps older journalists or more senior editors, for them, it's either email, call you on the phone, or just turn up to your desk. And I actually prefer those methods. So maybe I'm a rubbish example of Gen Z, but I think actually picking up the phone and calling someone is something that I hope never really dies in journalism, because I think that is still crucial to how we operate.
And just tell us again, I'm sorry for treating you as a sort of exhibit, but a zoo creature. But do you? I mean, apart from your very close friends, would you ever dream of calling somebody without first texting them or booking an appointment to make a call? Would that seem a strange thing to do?
I think I've actually, some of my my friends have sort of, they're not pleased about it because I know I've got into the journalist frame of mind of just doing that, and they don't pick up, and then I get this panic message like, is there something wrong? Why have you called me? And has someone died? And I'm like, oh yes, sorry, I meant to message you instead. So yeah, I think there's a culture among my generation of you wouldn't call someone without messaging them first, because that means it's bad news. And actually, I talk now as if this is completely natural. When I first started out, I interned for a little while at the Today program, and they just said, well, pick up the phone and call someone. And I think I was 19 or 20. I was terrified. That to me just felt so unnatural that you would call someone. And I thought, well, I'm going to be caught out. What if I don't say the right thing, or I'm not fluent enough? I haven't prepared. I don't get to type it all out in an email and make it all sound very nice. And by the end of the few weeks that I was there, it felt much more natural. So I don't think it's a dead skill.
Kamal, as we're destroying stereotypes tonight, the average age of your workforce is
25.
25.
Mm-hmm.
And the stereotype around those workers in the media is that actually they never go out. They would never go out and knock on doors or speak to people. They would never ring people up. They sit there just Googling it all. If it's not on Google, they go. Is that at all real?
I think we have to be quite careful not to treat this whole generation as a homogenous lump of people who all do the same thing. I know journalists, we like simplicity and black and white. They are very engaged in the world around them. I think as well, as you suggest, Laura, media people are a bit different from Generation Z. We're involved in the communications business. We're involved in storytelling, and we want to find things out, and we want to hold power to account. So my newsrooms are not probably a very good example of the whole of Generation Z, obviously. But they are, they're super keen. And just to, I think, Suzanne, you're absolutely right. Obviously, if you're building a tractor, there's a way to build a tractor. And doing a news story, there's a way to do news. So I want to be clear that it's not just I don't work in a kibbutz. It's not just everyone just kind of sitting around, holding hands and wearing flip-flops. We do have a business to run, and we do have to produce a certain amount of material every day. So just to sort of make that clear. But I think there is a different way. Their initial response to everything is messengers of different types, whether that's Slack, whether that's DMs on Twitter. They will always think that's the first way to approach things. But even if I'm thinking about my children, so as I say, my daughter's 23, my son is 19, they communicate in completely different ways from each other. So my son, it lives on Snap. There's no point in ringing my son because there's no way he'll pick up a phone he'll pick up his phone. He's on Snap all the time, and that's what he uses as his messaging platform. My daughter, though, will use the phone, but she uses mainly WhatsApp and Instagram. And so it changes very rapidly year to year as the platforms wax and wane in what they offer as ways of communicating. So I think it is text and word first, and then phone if you need to. But what is very interesting, actually, for this generation, the notion of gamification, Web 3.0, the next generation of how we communicate. If you go into the gaming space, the notion of group chat is much more normal for this generation. So you're on something, you're watching something, and you've got 10 people on group chat, all kind of sometimes talking, sometimes texting down the side. That's a very, very normal way. Just observing the way that young groups communicate with each other. So group chat is much more normal.
We're not going to let news dominate the evening, but you know what I mean when I say that there have been crises in newsrooms, mainly in the US, but not only in the US, where a generation of editors had just a different idea of what journalism was from the young people coming in. To them, there was more a sense of it was about identity, about activism. The older generation just fundamentally disagree with that. And you got very ruptured companies because they just had a different idea of what they were doing. How do you deal with that? Because listening is obviously not enough, because in the end, it's trying to craft one culture that has the same idea of what you're doing.
I think starting your own business has been much easier to do, where you set the culture from the start about the type of organization you are. We are very clear on ideas of non-partisan, and we don't engage in really the notions of culture wars, woke versus snowflake versus whatever the latest sort of traditional media meme is about young people and what they may or may not be like. And we were very clear from the start when we first started hiring what the news movement wanted to be, which was to be a space where all relevant opinion was taken seriously and respected. And we were never telling people what to think or do. That wasn't the point of us, because we know, and Laura, you all know this, and Suzanne maybe as well, one of the big issues for the news industry is, and has been revealed in the Reuters, the annual Reuters digital news report from Oxford, where the Reuters Institute is based, is news avoidance. And one of the key reasons for news avoidance, particularly amongst younger demographics, switching out of news coverage, is the constant 11 on the dial screaming at people about what they should be thinking, and every day the world appearing to be the end on the edge of a precipice. And lots of people are pulling out of that because it creates great anxiety, it creates helplessness, it creates fear. And we have very deliberately tried to be a place where we do cover tough stories, but in a way that gives you different types of journeys, looking for solutions. How can I navigate these things? And it's not an endless 24-hour cycle. We only produce 4 or 5 things a day, and then you're done. And then you can go and look at other things that interest you in your life. So we are very deliberately building a new model of how journalism looks and feels. And we've hired very deliberately in that image, and this notion of all relevant opinions are welcome. That doesn't mean false equivalence. We don't balance anti-racism messages with a few racists. We don't balance sort of climate change messages with a few climate change deniers. It's not that type of ridiculous false equivalence, but we are certainly, clear to our teams that if you want to be an activist and you want to prosecute a line, we're not the place for you. It doesn't mean that that is wrong, but we're not the place for you to flourish. And that's been a very clear benchmark for our culture. And it appears, literally touch wood, that we've avoided some, as you say, Alan, some of the more painful conversations that many organizations have gone through, where there is this generational divide on what news is and how journalists have to operate in those spaces.
Suzanne, you say if you're going to build a tractor, you can't spend too much time talking about it, but nevertheless, we're changing as a society, aren't we, from a very sort of top-down command and control idea of how things work to an age of social media where 3 billion people on the planet expect to have a say and can indeed publish. How do the organizations you're dealing with reflect that change in culture?
So I say you can't all sit down and decide how to build a tractor, but actually, as I reflect on it, you can see some of the changes. So if you go into one of our plants and you look at the kind of production line for a tractor, if I take that example, you do now have people kind of organized into kind of pods, as it were, along the production line. And within those pods, doing each kind of bit of the kind of production process, they will gather together and kind of work out what's working or not working in that kind of step of the process. They usually have a kind of whiteboard and they've got kind of issues that are coming up and they will kind of problem solve them live on the shop floor. And that's a very equal process. Everybody who's kind of in that kind of pod will provide input. So it's not entirely true to say that, what you can't do is say, well, I think we ought to put the kind of wheels on later. You can't make fundamental changes, or why don't we just kind of change the tractor and do it? But there is much more opportunity than in the past for people to kind of input into how that bit of the process works. So that definitely happens. And I think at kind of management and leadership level, there is much more input. I had to step into CEO, actually, this tractor company during COVID for a year, which was a fairly scary experience because it's a massive company. And of course, we were busy closing plants all over the world. Nobody quite knew what was happening. The rules were different in every single country. It was quite kind of frightening for everybody. And I found the only way to kind of get through that was to behave in this sort of way, because there was no way I knew what to do. I'd never been a CEO never been a CEO. Nobody knew what COVID was going to do. So the only way to kind of operate was to have quite a kind of open leadership style where you just asked lots of questions and then took a decision and then reversed the decisions that were wrong and kept plowing on with the ones which were right. And I think that leadership style is becoming a much more dominant leadership style than the lead from the front and shout loudly and tell everybody what to do. Because fundamentally, I actually think that kind of, and sometimes people call it a kind of servant leadership style. I do think that it not only works better with your generation, I think it kind of works better with everybody, actually. And I think it does lead to better decision making. And it doesn't mean that you still have to get to a point where you make a decision and you say, well, I'm sorry, I've heard everyone's views and I know some people don't agree and some people, this is what we're going to do. But you only do that once you have listened. And then whatever decision you've made, everybody feels that they've had a chance to provide input into it. So I'm not even sure it's I know your generation, kind of Laura, kind of coming wants that, but I actually think it's just a better leadership style.
I'm very interested in you saying that, because I was very conscious when I was editing The Guardian through a digital revolution that probably half my decisions were going to be wrong, because and it's kind of times 10 now with AI, that you're sailing into completely unknown waters. And I felt the problem with the old leadership style of standing up and saying, follow me, and I'll lead you to the sunlit uplands, is that you were going to regularly be wrong. And so you had to sort of crowdsource the decisions in a bit the way that so that even if you disagree with them, at least you could understand the rationale that led to them. And that if you changed your minds 3 months later, at least the workforce could understand why this was happening, which couldn't possibly work in an age of the mustachioed pinstripe leader saying. So presumably with AI, this is going to get even more complicated.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that I would necessarily link it to AI. AI is a whole new, interesting conversation. You can imagine it. It's a really interesting moment, to be honest, because how AI affects all of these different industries is really interesting. And some actually, I think, are going to benefit hugely from it. I mean, if you own data, this is a great time because AI just means that you can do more interesting things with that data. I mean, if you take a tractor company, actually, AI is by and large a great thing. I mean, you know, AI is not going to steal your tractors from you. It might make it easier for your tractors to communicate to your farmers if you use AI in the right sort of way. I'm not sure it really changes. I mean, I think AI will hopefully make companies communicate better in general. The number of times my companies send me a kind of letter that's supposed to go out to shareholders, and I read it, and it's just completely full of corporate speak. You know, they'll do things like, you know, we've just developed the next tractor, which is working on alternative propulsion in a more green and efficient way that helps the planet. And what they really mean is we've just developed a methane tractor that's running on cow dung. And, you know, they just don't write it like that. So AI will really help with communication generally. I'm not sure it will make a difference in terms of how you lead.
No. Laura, we've got this far without mentioning mental health, and I suppose that is a fairly big generational design. I think, Kamal, you might agree that when we were younger, it was not exactly taboo, but it was not a widely spoken of or even acknowledged thing in workplaces. Whereas now, people are much more comfortable. Not any more comfortable discussing it. It feels essential to discuss it. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yes, I would say that at university, I was at Oxford, but different college, there was a huge emphasis on mental health. And it was almost sort of every conversation that would come up. And I don't think that is the case in the workplace. I think you're correct that it's in no way the sort of taboo topic that it was before. And I think managers are much more receptive to you saying, I'm feeling very anxious, I'm feeling close to burnout. And I think they recognize that as a real problem. Whereas, you know, in the past, when I talk to older colleagues, it's sort of, or even colleagues in other industries, it was sort of physical illness was seen as a legitimate concern and not mental illness. I think there has been a shift, but maybe not quite as much as sometimes it's made out to be. I don't think it's a conversation that's had
daily. A more natural part of the workplace conversation? Or do you think there is a sort of slight taboo there still?
I think there is a slight taboo in the sense that I think there's still a sense that if you want to get ahead and be a powerful person, you have to put on a powerful exterior. And even though that might be wrong, I can still see the logic behind that. It's not something I would feel comfortable about necessarily going into work and talking about. But then again, that's sort of on me. I don't think it's a problem with the workplace in general. I think it's in many ways, that's an individual choice, how you present yourself in the workplace. And I think it is a presentation. You go into work and you're a different person from the person you are at home. And actually, I think that's one of the reasons why it's so good that lots of people are going back to the office, because I spent 18 months before I went into journalism working completely remotely, and I absolutely despised it. I hated being in my bedroom 24/7. And now I have work and home as two separate places where I can be two slightly different people.
Kamal, with your young workforce, is mental health a big issue and issues of burnout? Do you send out emails saying you don't have to respond to this after 5 o'clock in the evening and all that?
And we're a news organization still, Alan, so I'm afraid news happens when it happens. So we still have the strictures of news and how we have to operate. If Boris Johnson decides to quit as an MP at 8:30 in the evening on a Friday, then he's decided to quit as an MP.
Couple that on Monday morning.
I can't say, well, I can't now approach any of my team because they're too, they're at home with their kind of cucumbers on their eyes. And they're not like that. So again, it's
doing stereotype.
They're not like that. So, but I think it's mental health, but it's sort of mental welfare. I remember. So before I started on The Guardian, I worked for newspapers in Scotland, and I remember one of the first stories I covered was Dunblane and the appalling events there of the massacre of the children, and without a thought, you were just sent to cover this. You know, I was a young journalist in my early 20s, and I was sent to cover this appalling event, with parents obviously coming out not knowing whether their children were what some of the murdered children at this school. And I remember driving back from Dunblane to the office in Edinburgh, and having to stop my car on the hard shoulder on the motorway between Stirling and Edinburgh, and just bursting into tears. And being put in those types of situations are clearly not a healthy situation to be in. But you would never mention it. You wouldn't. I kind of, you know, got myself together, put my face on for work, and went into the office. Now, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't have been sent there to cover it, but the emotional part of the job of being a creator and being in journalism, I think, is now much more thought about and thought through. Not meaning that you don't go and cover it, but that you know that there is support around you for how you can help yourself through those types of events, because a lot of journalism is very tough, and it's tough for good reason, because the public need to, you know, we need to hold power to account. We need to cover the world, and many of those things that we cover are crises and have appalling human stories behind them. But I hope that the journalism world is now much better at thinking about that. So we talk about it much more as a welfare issue, and about supporting our teams in the work they do. And we do take it much more seriously. It's much more expected. But Suzanne, to your point, it's helpful for everybody. That, frankly, is helpful for me. It's helpful for all of us to think much more carefully about mental welfare. And I think to be much more deliberate about what you might describe as equity. So when you think about, you know, people with disabilities, when you think about, you know, that people are carrying different things in their lives, which make the way they operate different from other people. You don't rank those things. There's not good and bad. It's just that notion of difference is much clearer now and understood than when I came into the industry, which was very much of a certain type, which you fitted in with. When I started in my career, I was just sort of happy to be there. And I would do anything to try and be successful in this amazing vocation that I'd stumbled into, which was journalism. Now people much more want respect, and they know they have options in a way which are different from the ones maybe I had and maybe you had, Alan, when we started in our careers in journalism. And I think that's a good thing. I think we discuss it a lot more. We have time to discuss these types of issues, and I hope it allows people to be much more in a space which is much more enjoyable, and therefore actually how they work and what they produce is better.
We should probably put this open to questions. And I know you've got some. Do you want to start with? Have you got any good ones coming out? Yeah. All right. Give us a good one.
It's got some big words in it, so bear with me.
Okay. I'll translate.
Is there a difference in how a multi-generational workforce may wish to access mental health support, which may parallel the varied ways of communication in different generations, e.g. digital versus face-to-face?
Who would like to take that?
Yeah, well, I suspect the answer to that is yes. I mean, I was reflecting as you were talking. I mean, the big shift that I've seen in my career around mental health is the one that you mentioned, which is people are just much more willing to talk about it. So in my kind of workplaces, it is an acceptable conversation. Whereas frankly, when I started work, it was not an acceptable conversation. If you were having a bad day or somebody was depressed or whatever, you just didn't talk about it because you put your work face on and you kind of went in. And this kind of impacted me actually when I was, it's interesting, when I wrote the book, I knew I was going to have to talk about some of the, I'm not sure if mental health is the right phrase, but some of the really quite emotional stuff that I went through, including becoming so depressed when my parents basically abandoned my brother and me and went sailing off that I ended up ringing up Childline. And I did kind of pause before I wrote the book because I had a bit of a choice. I either was going to write it quite honestly, or I was going to try and take some of those bits out. But then everyone would notice, because frankly, I just think it's very obvious when you take stuff out. But if I put it in, I also have this kind of work side of me, all this kind of serious stuff that I do. And somehow, how is that going to mix with writing about a childhood where I got so depressed that I ended up ringing up Childline, and I had nightmares about this kind of shipwreck, which affected me for a long time as well. But actually, I do think the world has changed because I decided I could do it. And actually, I haven't really found that people have criticized that or put one against the other and thought, hang on a moment, if you had such a difficult childhood, maybe you're somehow less qualified to look after companies. So back to the actual question, which I know wasn't really that at all. It was more how people access it. I mean, I actually did, and this again kind of reflects the kind of new openness. On my medical insurance, you could get kind of 10 sessions of therapy. So after my late husband died, everybody kept on saying, you should go and do some counselling, Suzanne. And I kept on going, no, I'm British. You don't do that. We just don't do that sort of thing. And eventually I did. And I have to say, I spent the first half of the first session talking about Jeremy, but it's not a complicated thing. It's just a very sad thing. Spent the next 9.5 discussing my parents. And if anyone reads the book, you'll find out why 9.5 sessions probably was inadequate for the subject. But actually, all of them I did online. And it was really, because it was in the middle of the pandemic. And actually, that worked really well. It was really good. And in fact, I remember kind of talking to the therapist at the end of it, because I was talking about different ways of communicating. And these new ways of working, again, there may be a kind of a generational thing, but frankly, some of these things are just better. I mean, that sort of thing actually does work quite well, because you can have the conversations whilst being in your own home. You're not going off to somebody else's kind of, somehow that actually is quite good. So I think the answer to your question is almost certainly younger generations will want to do this more remotely, but I actually think some of these things are better anyway. And so we should probably just encourage people to do them anyway. I mean, if I was ever going to do it again, I would definitely kind of do it remotely.
Let's have a question from somewhere in the room. Oh, crikey. Jessica,
Wow.
choose one.
Hi, my question is, there's been quite a lot of kind of jokes about the different biases that maybe each generation has and how they respond. But it probably might speak to quite a kind of serious thing, in that actually different generations do listen to messages differently. So I guess my question is, like, how does an organization bring all these different groups together, and how does it speak to them without sort of passing one and hitting others? And are there any examples of organizations, corporates, or non-profits who do this really well, and what are the kind of outcomes that show that they're doing it really well?
Kamal, is that?
Yeah, I don't know about examples. I think the big thing I think that has changed for businesses is that you have to give all the demographics optionality. I think that what we tended to find in corporates, if you go sort of 20 years ago, you had to be a certain type of person to be successful in certain ways. Now it's all about optionality. Otherwise, you will lose talent, because talent will go to where it feels most comfortable now, because there is an abundance of choice, which, as I said, we didn't have as much in our industry, in the media industry, as there is now. So I think that what you have to do is look for organizations where they understand that need for choice. So to that previous question about, well, do young people want it more digitally rather than face-to-face? Well, they want both and everything is now both and. And corporations that do that well, I think, are the ones that are going to be successful. I don't know about actually direct examples, but one I went in to see PwC quite recently, and we were just talking to them about various pieces of work that they were doing. And they ran through lots and lots of different ways that they were particularly interested in people from different economic backgrounds and different socioeconomic backgrounds, and work they had done, and different geographies as well, because it's not just socioeconomic, but it's also geography around the UK. And I was struck by how hard they had worked at making their workplace a place where people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different geographies, could feel comfortable in different environments. So the key for me is, for a long time, it was all about joining the table, but the table remained the same, the leadership table. Now we've got to move the table, and the table's got to look and feel different. Otherwise, you might be increasing your notional diversity, but you're not increasing equity and inclusion, because nothing's actually changed. Just a new cohort of people have become the same as the leaders that they follow. And I think that's a key thing for us all to think about.
Another question from the room. Jessica, I'm leaving you to, yeah.
Thank you. I just had a question around on media and intergenerational. So in terms of content creation, how do you approach within media content creation targeted towards different generations, given that, for example, younger generations, it's kind of leaning more towards fast food media, i.e., you know, you get 5 slides on Instagram that kind of give you a summary of the news, versus potentially older generations that appreciate sort of long form journalism. How do you approach that?
Laura, you were talking a bit earlier about trying to get younger readers.
Yeah.
Will younger readers read long bits of text, or do you have to spoon feed them?
I think the key is, as we were talking before about options, we might have one story, but we will have lots of different ways that anyone can view that story. So obviously we have the print product, which skews towards an older readership. We'll also have the website, which is slightly younger, and we might present an article in a different way online. It might have a video embedded, it might have a different kind of headline because it's attracting a different kind of audience. And then we'll also have our social media channels, and we've got a social media team who will work to look at that article and to think, first of all, is this an article that will be fit for our social media audience? And then how can we reframe it in a way that will be interesting to them? So as you say, that might be slides on Instagram where we take out the very key messages of the story, or we'll look for a story which we feel is particularly pictorial and will be represented well on Instagram. So I think that's the process at the moment. I suppose the next step for media would be almost, and there are some organizations doing it already, to take a step back and at the commissioning level to think about that, as opposed to once the article is written to think about it. So you might at a commissioning level think, this is a story that we are going to commission for TikTok, or this is a story that we're going to commission for Instagram. Although actually on long reads, I think my generation still are interested in long reads, and you know, big New Yorker stories will attract people of all generations. And I know lots of my peers will sit and read maybe a 3,000, 4,000 word article if it's, you know, if it's interesting enough. So I think I really hope that long form journalism is not going to die. I don't think it will. I think it's around to stay, no matter how we present it.
Yeah, you've got another question from our audience online.
Yeah, just one more. How can we return to having a variety of ideas and ensuring discussion rather than a binary approach of agree or be cancelled?
Suzanne?
Wow. Okay. Thanks. So yeah, we were discussing beforehand. In a way, I think we both benefit from having kind of kids. You know, I can think our kids are similar ages. Mine are 21, 19, which means I'm very conscious of this kind of this notion that there's a whole bunch of things that you're not supposed to say. And I see my kind of kids actually on some topics running completely scared. They won't even have the conversation. So with one of my kids, I said, so how do you describe the color of somebody's skin? And they said, you don't. I said, so if you're going to walk into a restaurant and the only thing that you knew about somebody was their skin color, could you say that? No, you can't say that. And it's very interesting. We have a kind of generation where there are topics which you just can't, there's no word, because I was trying to explore what is the correct word. Is there a kind of good word or a bad? No, you just can't kind of go there. And we have similar sorts of issues with gender, where people are just now, what word do you use? Any word that you use immediately puts you into one camp or another camp, which means that a different camp is not going to like you. And so again, everybody kind of runs scared and doesn't kind of talk about it. And for me, I don't know what the right answer is on some of these things, but it feels like we're in, I mean, I feel very uncomfortable in a space where we can't even have a conversation about it, where, you know, my children who are much more sensitive to it than I do, literally say, don't even have that conversation. Don't even get into that conversation. You don't even, you know, it's not even a question of whether you're on the right side of it or the wrong side of it. You just can't even have that conversation. And that does worry me. So I am quite careful not to have the conversation whilst feeling very uncomfortable about the fact that we seem to have got into this world where there are now subjects that we can't engage with. And I kind of hope that we're going to get to a point where we can at least have that conversation and we don't have people who are going to condemn people for one position or another.
Kamal, is there anything you want to add to that?
I'm more positive than that. I think
Yeah.
that conversation is changing, which I think is a great thing. I think that it's more considered now about what your words may mean or suggest. And I think it's a much more positive environment. Certainly when I grew up, the types of conversations that were not batted an eye at with, which would involve racism, gender stereotypes, sexism, comments about disability, weight, whatever it might have been. I think that it's quite a joyful thing that people want to be more considered about how they speak and what they speak about. I certainly don't find, obviously you've had a different experience. I certainly don't find that you're not allowed to talk about anything. It's just having consideration about how you talk about it. And I think that there are more positives in that than there are negatives, given the world that certainly I grew up in. I mean, I wrote a book in 2018 about growing up as a mixed Black person in London in the 70s and 80s, where the language was, I mean, that's only one part of it, but was so aggressive that you had to live with every day, connected to the color of my skin and my own heritage. And I think it's good that we're considering much more carefully. And I suppose that the point is that's then being whipped into a war. And I just don't really see that that is actually happening for younger people, all the younger people I work with, and actually my children. But they do say you need to take care in some areas because things can be misconstrued.
It's 7 o'clock. Those of you who were out there earlier know that there's drink and sunshine waiting for us. So I think we promised people this would be an hour, so we'll stop there. I know Ollie's going to.
I say this every time. This special little club. I know some of you are subscribers to Prospect Magazine. Can you hold it up, Alan? This literally published yesterday, wasn't it? Was it
Today?
Today.
Today. Yeah.
Fresh off the press, long form journalism at its best. They're about 24, 25 pages long for those of you that can manage that. Brilliant. It's a brilliant magazine. And I would like more. I subscribe, I buy it for friends and family. I've also bought a couple of your books. So I want to put a plug. There are 30 copies of Wavewalker upstairs, Breaking Free. And they're actually in a room. I think most people will be going outside. So what we might do is, in fact, I can see my middle daughter there can go around selling the book, I'm sure, outside. Absolutely. So selling signed copies, yes, signed copies. So 2 purchases tonight, the book and an annual subscription to Prospect
as well.
But I just want to say, I think we lucked out tonight not having Sir Will and not having Charlotte. I genuinely thought it was an exceptional conversation, and I'd like to thank Alan, Laura, Suzanne, and Kamal for a most amazing conversation tonight. So thank you very much indeed.